All right. Hi, guys. How are you? Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kelsey Kernstine. For those of you that don't know me, I have worked with Ileana at News Nation. And of course, I've always known Joel's work. So awesome to be here today. And of course, we're talking about the big one, the Menendez brothers resentencing hearing. Lots of eyes are on this happening today and tomorrow in Los Angeles. And I'm so excited about this. I can't even believe it. Dr. Ann Burgess is here with me today. I'm going to share more about, of course, how her important role on the case. But first, let's kind of break down the case together. For those of you that don't know this case and that are just tuning in, of course, this happened back in 1989. The parents of Erik and Lyle Menendez were found murdered in their Beverly Hills home. This was a very nice area. This is not typically what you would see in the Beverly Hills area back in 1989. Jose and Kitty Menendez, Jose being a very high-powered executive. They lived in a very nice home, and they were found shot to death multiple times. But the self-defense, they were arguing, right? There were two trials. The first trial ultimately was a hung juries. Then the second trial led to their conviction of them killing their parents and life in prison, no parole. And ultimately, self-defense argued that this was years of sexual abuse. But then you had the prosecution arguing, no, they were just trying to get their parents' inheritance, and that this was premeditated. There's been these huge Netflix documentaries. There's been other documentaries. And this, of course, has been in the public eye for quite some time. Lots of people really want, and it's a new day, right? Sexual abuse today. When it comes to a trial, we're going to talk to Dr. Ann Burgess all about this. It maybe would have been tried a little differently. And these are going to be a lot of my questions today. If the trial were to take place today, is there more leniency for, say, sexual abuse victims? They also filed a habeas corpus hearing or a habeas corpus petition because they had new evidence. There was a note that came forward that Erik Menendez wrote to his cousin, alleging the abuse by his father. There was also a Menudo boy band member that has come forward saying that he was allegedly raped by Jose Menendez. So we're going to get to all of this. You had the DA's office, Nathan Hochman, really against and opposing this resentencing hearing, trying to deny it, but then the judge saying, no, we're gonna continue on with it. That's why it's going to be so interesting to see what happens these next couple of days. And ultimately, it's really going to be up to the judge to decide. Now, when it comes to what they're going to be discussing over the next couple of days, of course, this new evidence, the Menudo boy band member, this letter they're going to talk about, the family members that want to see their release. They're also going to be talking about this mostly by the defense. And this letter specifically saying, I think this is just so eye-opening, happening 8 months before the murders took place. I've been trying to avoid Dad. It's still happening, Andy, but it's worse for me now. And every night I stay up thinking he might come in. The defense has also argued they've been good prison citizens. But then you have the prosecution saying, no, this was premeditated. They are cold-blooded killers. And there's a litany of lies here. And so joining me now to really break it all down, of course, she's a witness expert when it came to testimony, 5 hours giving testimony during this trial when it took place, and just incredible career. She's been an author, professor, criminal psychologist, also a former psychiatric nurse, just a trailblazing woman. First, I kind of want to ask you here, Dr. Ann Burgess, I'm going to ask you down the road if you think that they should be released today. But first, I want to ask you, when you first met Erik Menendez, and I know that you interviewed him for 50 hours, what was your initial impression of him?
Well, my initial impression of Erik was he looked like you would expect any 20, I think it was like 23 at the time. But I would look at him in terms of what was he like when he was 18, which is when this all started, as you just said. And he looked like what you would expect any young high school student, if you will, or college student would look. He was unassuming. He was straightforward. He smiled. It didn't have any of the guarded effect. I certainly have interviewed enough other persons that have murdered, and he didn't have that type of demeanor, if you will. He was able to talk easily. We chatted about a lot of things. I know you probably want to know some of them, but he looked pretty average for a young man of that side, albeit that we knew what he had done, because there was no question. I think that's the other important thing. There was no question that he had done this by the time I saw him.
Was there any part of you that was fearful?
No, no.
And why do you think that was?
Well, I think for a lot of reasons. First of all, he was in a protected setting. He was in prison, or he was in jail. I'm sorry, he was in jail, and they had him. His ankles he had handcuffs on his ankles and his hands. I later asked that they remove them. I needed them removed because I needed to get some work from him, writing and sketching and so forth. But I had no fear of him. First of all, I wasn't a family member. This was a domestic shooting.
Well,
Very
you spent
different from stranger. Sorry.
I mean, just incredible. You spent 50 hours with him. What were some of these questions? And then how did you arrive at getting him to draw?
Well, the first time that I met him, I certainly wanted to establish some type of relationship. I know I was going to be there for several days, so I wasn't going to jump right in and say, "Tell me what happened." I wanted to see how he would carry on, if he could carry on a fairly normal conversation. So we talked about things like what he was doing, how it was for him in prison, in jail, those kinds of things. What was he eating? How was he sleeping? Just in general, what were the kinds of things that he was thinking about? In turn, he asked me how my trip was. I had come in from Boston, so he had some very questions to ask me, which I thought were very appropriate, that at least he had thought about what this was going to be about, the interview would be about. So it seemed quite usual, quite normal in that respect. And that was the first day, or the first interview that I had. I didn't get into what happened until I found out or decided I was going to get the sketching, the drawings.
And at what hour in did you start having him draw?
I knew I was going to have the better part of a day, depending on what his schedule was. You always have to be careful. Sometimes they have lockdowns. They have the loudspeakers saying things. So I was into it in terms of probably the first hour that I saw him on the second day. And I said to him, I said, I'd like to get some sketches from you of what happened, how this happened. We had started he knew I was going to ask about what happened and how he could describe it to me. And he knew I had plenty of records, so I could see, it wasn't like I was going to see anything new. But I wanted to see from his perspective, from how he had kept this whole episode in his mind and how he could put it on paper. And that was really, really important, because I didn't know whether he would do one drawing or do 20 drawings. You never know when you ask someone to draw what happened.
And what was it really that stood out in this drawing to you?
Well, when you looked at all of them, I think he did 14 of them for me, is where they happened. I was very interested that much of the conversation and the activity was in his bedroom. Now, that's a big house. You've already described where he lived in a very big house, and there are plenty of rooms. One of them was in a hallway, that's true, and one was, I think, in a den. But for the most part, I thought that was very interesting that he put it in the bedroom. And that matched what we were getting information from people that were interviewing the family members of where Jose would take Erik. When they were all there for a dinner, and yet they all had to wait. He took them back into the bedroom. So that I always thought was very important for Jose, certainly.
And was this before or after you knew that there was any type of sexual abuse?
Well, this is the process of getting it, is what he was going to be talking about. It hadn't come out at that time. We were still, when I say we, the team was still looking at what a defense would be, I think. I think what was important to me is when I had looked at the case before coming out and seeing him, is it didn't make sense to me. I knew that the prosecution was going to say these are just greedy kids. But it didn't make sense. They had all the money they needed. They didn't want for any money. kind of thing. And every other kind of possible motive had been ruled out. So at that point, I felt that there was something in this family that was going on. It was the dynamics, if you will, of the family that I needed to see if I could find out some information about.
And, when it comes to sexual abuse by the father, what kind of role does that play in a child?
Well, a father is a very key authority figure. Certainly in this family, he was the authority. He was a patriarchal type of family. So you had to do whatever he said. That was the rules, if you will, if you want to look at cultures and dynamics in families. Yeah, he was the authority.
Do you think, and obviously this would be so much speculation, is it typically people that, are predators like this and they do this sexual abuse with children, their own children? In the research that you have done, is that typically in their line of family? Is it because it's been done to them?
Well, don't forget at the time that this was happening, which I was seeing him in the early 90s, is the only literature out there was Judith Herman's work on incest between father and daughter.
Wow.
People were getting pretty educated on that. Her work was groundbreaking, if you will. And so we could understand that, or learn about it, I should say. The issue of, and I had one case, I think, of father-son incest in the time. It was either right about that time or I had one case. That was the only case I had of in the family, father-son. There could be other relatives, so to speak, but we're specifically looking at father-son. So it wasn't widely, and not even sexual abuse of boys was not, even though it was happening, it was not widely discussed, at least to the lay public. Certainly among persons in the field, therapists in the field, we were reading it, and I certainly had seen a little bit of it in our study. Our study was back in the 70s, and we had some young, but boys, really young boys, not necessarily adolescent.
Was it during this time that people, you think, because there wasn't enough research, that people didn't really think that maybe that this was possible by such a high-powered executive?
Oh, yes, I think that was it. Well, and the important thing was it was an incest secret. I think that you need to understand it as a secret. And secrets are very powerful. They have a lot of power within the secret, but when it gets exposed, there's a lot of aftermath, if you will. And so it was a secret that what would that do to Jose Menendez? As you just said, he's a very powerful figure in the media. Was that going to be enough to hurt his career? And so from that standpoint, I think that's the way, part of the way the brothers looked at it, as well as what it meant to them personally.
What happens with trauma like this? You look at the killing, and they didn't just shoot once. They shot multiple times, and also shooting their mother, who also tried to flee. What goes off in the brain to do something like this?
Well, first of all, remember, they had never shot a gun before. They had to take a lesson to learn how, and of the guns they picked the wrong ones. They put shotguns. So they did not know very much. They knew nothing about guns, really. So I think when you get into how many times and where they hit and all of that, you have to look at the fact of the first time they were shooting. And if you've ever shot a shotgun, there's a lot of a buck to it, it bounces, and you don't really have much control over it at times. You need to talk to someone that's really an expert. But I think a lot of that went into how that happened. I never heard him say that any particular part of the body was focused on. It's just that they marched in and then they started shooting. So from that standpoint, the other thing that, of course, I testified to is I was very surprised when the police came in and heard from the brothers, or certainly at least from Erik, that they smelled smoke, gun smoke. They smelled smoke, meaning gun smoke. Well, they had been out of they said they had been out of the movie, and to come back in, they never would, that length of time, it would not have been in the room. And that's why I said I was surprised that the police didn't realize that and just do a very simple test of their hands to find out if they had any residue on. That would have stopped it right there. And in fact, many of both of the, certainly Erik, thought that they would be arrested that at that time when they came back. So,
yeah. No, please proceed.
No, so I think when you see it from their side, and then you look at it from your side, I mean, we're looking at it both from how we think it happened, but not necessarily certainly from the way it happened to them. So all of those factors is what I tried to think about and to deliberate about and put the whole case together.
When it comes to the shooting, when somebody's in a trauma response like that, do they shoot out of fear or do they shoot out of anger?
Fear. Fear is what is driving all of this. And that was the thing that we tried to get across, is the fear that they had, even though it doesn't seem logical. That's where the imperfect defense comes in. What you and I think about this is not the way they saw it. So that's the imperfect piece. They thought they had the fear that something awful was going to happen if this secret came out. And don't forget, it wasn't just the sexual abuse. There was a lot of psychological and physical aspects, if you will, to their growing up. And that was documented in witnesses that came forward and talked about the intimidation, if you will, how fearful people were of Jose because he was such a powerful, big executive. You know, there's a lot of power in that.
I also find it so interesting that all of these years later, you have a Menudo boy band member coming forward saying he was allegedly raped. I mean, why keep silent for so long? And then seeing the brothers go through all what they went through, knowing that there's other victims, alleged victims, like the Menudo boy band member. Why wait so long to come forward?
Well, in my clinical experience with doing a lot of interviews with children and so forth, it's been my experience that unless a young boy who's being sexually abused has a witness, he will not report it. The only cases that we were often able to get is where there was a witness, another boy, another person. It's such the bias and the belief that men should never claim that. Actually, many of the things that came out in the prosecution, those were the biases against any type of sexual abuse of a male, any age.
Was that extremely difficult for you? I mean, I watched the entire testimony, 5 hours, right? I believe it was a total of 5 hours. I mean, and some of these are extremely hard questions to answer. Was that difficult to expose all of this, especially in a time and a day where, honestly, sexual abuse was almost laughed at?
Right. And to a prosecutor that didn't believe in it. I mean, the bias was so great. Yes, to your question. Yes, it was very difficult. It was not easy at all.
Do you think
I had to wear a virtual bulletproof vest going into that courtroom?
Do you think that if this trial would have taken place today, that it would have gone a different way?
I do. I certainly do. Yes, because there's been a lot. Obviously, there's been a lot more education, if you will, and understanding. And you just ask rape crisis centers or therapists or clinicians, I bet they all have a caseload of this type of incident.
When it comes to the alleged trauma like this, do you think it can be healed? Do you think that there's always going to be this, and I think you described it as it rewires your brain?
Right. It lodges in the amygdala section of the brain and it stays there. It's wired in. And I don't think you can cure it, but I think you can treat it. And that's kind of the position I take on it and try to teach young clinicians about how you can, it's never going to go away. It's that set, if you will. And that's the way it is for people in other kinds of monumental experiences that we've all had, is that you can always remember it if it has enough of a power to it, especially when it's kind of linked to emotion, and the emotion is fear. Don't forget, basic survival of humans and animals, of course, is survival. So we are wired in to be wary of danger. We should be.
I know that you said in the testimony that you felt that the crime scene lacked organization. Why was it exactly that you felt it lacked organization, and that this really entire event, the crime scene, the killing, lacked premeditation?
Right. I said that it was a disorganized crime scene because, for one thing, they picked the wrong gun if they really wanted to do what they wanted to do, and they would have planned it better. It wasn't well planned. If you notice, a lot of what they thought they could do, go to this movie and meet up with a friend, none of that happened. So from a plan standpoint, and they came back and were sure, they were shocked, if you will, that they weren't arrested. So from that standpoint, I don't think they didn't get away with it, certainly. Excuse me.
When you were able to expose to them, right? Because you were, it sounds like, the one that had the ability to say, this is what you've been keeping secret all these years. You did this because of the sexual trauma. Do you think that was an awakening for them?
Well, I think it was an awakening for them as to how it was explained, yes, because don't forget, they were caught up in this. They were caught up in the abuse and the trauma over the years. And so they get to a certain age, is young or later adolescence, and then they get into this whole situation, and then they hear. I think when they hear in court what testimony was, I think that was very, very important. Because they all had, Lyle had his own expert, John Conti, and on the psychological abuse, there was Stewart, was also a expert. So they had a number of experts talking, at least in the first first trial. And I think it's very important between the first and the second of how it was set up. So no information was going to be given from defense side about any kind of motive.
Do you think it's possible that if these brothers say they were released, do you think that it's possible that somebody with, say, the alleged trauma that they say happened to them, with the killing of their parents, do you think that they can be good members of society?
If they have been, you're saying if they have been in prison, and yes, I think it's because prison has a goal, a rehabilitative goal, which of course these two are going through. And so, yes, this is a domestic type of killing, not strangers. Strangers are a whole different group, if you will. So I do think that, yes, that there, and it's often done. So often it's done, and the recidivism is very low, I think, at any type of domestic incident.
Do you think that the prison, though, has the capability of getting them the right type of treatment to be able to help them work through some of this trauma?
I don't know. I don't have any information on what type of treatment they had, but I do know that they have done important activities to better their situation. And I know Lyle has been running groups, sexual abuse groups, childhood sexual abuse for some of the inmates, and that they've done a lot of other things that are speak. And I think you probably will get into that, or certainly at the hearing they will. That says they could have just sat and said, I'm not going to do anything, but they took advantage of their situation and said they were going to try to do something. And I think that will be, I hope that will be taken into consideration, because that's the purpose. They've had 35 years about all this.
Do you think in some ways, because of how little we knew about sexual abuse and sexual abuse by the father and incest, Do you think in some ways the legal system maybe failed these brothers?
Well, I missed the last part of your question. I'm sorry.
Do you think in some way the legal system maybe failed these brothers because of how little we knew at the time, research when it comes to the mind and what sexual abuse trauma can do to someone?
I'll go. The legal system, yes. Well, the legal system is only as effective as people that run it, use it. And I think that it was so easy in this case for the prosecution to say these were just greedy kids when they didn't have, I don't know whether they brought in any expert to say, oh, kids always go around killing their parents just to get money. I don't know whether they brought anyone in like that. That was their theory, right? Rather than that these young men were terrified and fearful of what might happen if this secret came out. So that's where I think that what the system failed was in the second trial, that they didn't allow having any experts are usually allowed to bring in for defense to bring in certainly some kind of expert to explain to the jury why this happened. You don't have to prove motive, don't forget. In a case, you don't have to prove it. But this case seemed to really pivot around the whole issue of motive.
Was it hard for you to watch the verdict come down all those years ago?
Well, let me say I wasn't surprised, and especially after I had an opportunity to talk with one of the jurors and to see how the jury dealt with it, because that's who you have to depend on in a trial, is how those juries interpret. And that's why it's so important to do the voir dire ahead of time, that you get people that are really biased. And it looked like all the males on that first trial were very much they were not going to believe this. And all the females were able. And I think that's very, very telling. Very, very important.
What was it in particular that jury said to you, juror?
Well, what she said is that she talked to me about my testimony. She wrote a book and she has that in there. She said that's where we learned about sexual trauma and sexual abuse. And she said it was like getting a course in it. And it's where I talked about what the beginning at that time, all the research that was going on in the brain and how the brain registers information and captures it and keeps it in different areas. That's why we have a brain. And so she found that very helpful. And obviously the other women did too. But the men, I remember one point where she said, one of the men even said, those experts get paid to come in. I weren't going to believe any of them. And I think she tried to remind them that they were also being paid to be a juror. So I thought that was kind of interesting that she was able to do that. But it shows you the level of the bias at that time. And maybe currently, look at what's going on now. You have a district attorney that is absolutely sure he's right. And where's his evidence?
Yeah, it's interesting. He is gung-ho that he does not think that they should be released, that there should be no resentencing, that this was premeditated, this was cold-blooded murder. It's been 35 years. It's fascinating. And now knowing what we know now about sexual abuse. For those of you watching, because I know a lot of people in the comments section, they are writing me as we speak. I'm not exactly sure how to bring up these comments. To show them on the screen so Dr. Burgess can see them too. So please, if any of you have comments, please write, or any questions, please write them in the comment section. I would love to ask Dr. Burgess. Dr. Burgess, I find it so interesting what we know now. There's so much more information about sexual abuse. With modern psychology today, would you have done the testimony different with the things that we know now today about the brain and sexual trauma? Anything you would have done differently?
I can't think of anything I would have done differently. It would have been the same level of testimony. Well, we have better statistics. I'll just say that. We certainly have better statistics on male sexual trauma. I've done some really important cases. where, just to give you an example, one of the cases we looked at was out of a university where they had a rogue doctor in that was, anytime anybody needed any kind of a physical examination, he sexually abused them. And when that finally was exposed, like 30 years later, they had over thousands of men, these are all men, coming forward when they had been young adolescent athletes, if you will. And yet, even though some of them did make comments to their coaches, the coaches would say, you don't talk that way. Just, be a Marine, keep your mouth shut, buck up, kind of thing. So that, if anything, certainly was able to convince me that this was a huge problem. That did, because there were thousands. We're talking about thousands of young males who, some of them quit the school because of that, and others that continued. So you had a wide range, and we've published that paper. It's a really important paper, I think. So to answer your question, it goes on. It just doesn't get explored and explained.
Why do these sexual trauma victims, why do they wait so long to come forward and talk about the alleged abuse?
Because of their feelings about it. It's often a lot of guilt that they didn't speak up, that they didn't say something, and the fact that they maybe in some way they allowed it. This is a male on male. That's a very different kind of a abuse situation than male to female.
This is Nina Stanek, and I don't know how to bring your question up. Let me see if I can do it. Oh, it's here. Okay, we did it. I'm learning every time, you guys, when I come on and I do this. Nina Stanek is asking this. A lot of sexual assault victims, sexual abuse victims become perpetrators themselves, like one of the brothers assaulting the other brother. How is he not a danger to the public?
Well, what's important in that question is the actual how this all happens. Most sexual abuse between children, young childhood abuse, is in the family. And they do test it out with other siblings. And then if they're going to go on into more of a sexually aggressive position, they move into the neighborhood. And then from the neighborhood, they move into strangers and adults. So that seems to be the trajectory, that many cases where you have a adult rapist that has a childhood experience, if they continue, that happens. So in this case, yes, we did have where Lyle does, I think was important on the witness stand, apologize for what he did, but he never continued it. And he was actually shocked to find out that the father had continued it, saying he didn't know. Well, if he didn't know, it shows you how secret this behavior can be. So to answer her question, yes, it can. But you would hope that nowadays you'd get a family member, somebody would pick up the fact that was going on and get them into treatment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a really good friend who had never told anyone that she was sexually abused, and never told anyone. And it was so interesting being friends with her, because she would lie to me almost about everything, to the point where I had to set boundaries because I didn't understand all the lies. I mean, there were lies about the food she was eating, like lies that just didn't make sense. And then as a person, I also didn't understand at the time, well, why didn't you ever explain this to your mom? Like, this was the handyman that came over. Why, share it with them now. And that was never my place as a friend to share what happened to her. But the secrets were so hard to deal with, even as a friend. I didn't understand it. Why does that happen?
Well, I think you got caught. A lot of people get caught up with what you got caught up. They don't know what to do. But what she did do was what's fairly typical, is she tried to tell someone, whether it was because she didn't know what to do. She didn't have the strength to come forward. And we don't know, in your case, whether she did go to her mother. There are cases where the mother will say, don't say anything. That can happen. So I'm never always convinced that the mother or whomever the adult is will do anything about it.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, and it's so interesting because I started reading about it and just becoming so interested in what happens when these things happen to us as young people, right? We can't understand what is happening to us. And then the things that happen later in life. And I had read, a lot of women will have eating disorders or they'll eat just to like hide the trauma. It's just,
Right.
I could spend hours talking to you about this. Trishy 818 is asking this. This case would have gone so differently if it would have happened today. Burgess's testimony would have helped expose the true horror of the boys' experiences. Do you believe that to be true?
I think that it would have been um, heard differently. I think that's what I like to say is that hopefully it would have been heard differently by the men in the jury. That was the problem, is that we didn't get it. It was very hard to break through the biases in the male opinion on can boys be abused. Now, they might have even come forward and not been believed. I think that the mother, that's one of the reasons you would ask, why did they, or other people ask about why the mother was targeted. They tried to get the mother to come with them to come east to the East Coast. That was one of the things they had tried to do, and she refused. So they made that in their minds, in the brother's mind, that she was going to go along with the father.
There's been this like constant discussion, the abuse is happening from the father. Why? Why shoot the mother so many times? Why?
Well, they had these guns, and as I said, they just automatically kept shooting. I think that their own panic, which they described at that particular time of what they were doing, kind of played into that. That's the only explanation that they were able to, or at least Erik was able to give me.
What would you say to the people? Because, people are, on one side, they're like, they should be in prison for the rest of their lives. These are cold blooded killers. But then you got, people on the other side saying this is sexual abuse. This is trauma. And this is something, this happened in a day where we didn't know a lot about sexual trauma. What would you say to those people that say that they should be in prison for the rest of their lives?
Well, I think that they need to look at what they have done in their 35 years and whether that has been something that has rehabilitated them. I think we need to understand better what rehabilitation is all about and how long do you have to go for punishment, if you will. Those must be people that believe you be punished forever, I guess, that there's no way and no hope. I've always been I always thought it's always unfair when people get absolutely no possibility of parole. I think that takes away any hope. And many of the serial killers we study, they can go up for parole. It doesn't mean they're good, and they never get it. But the idea that they still have a chance is important just in human dealing with human beings.
Do you think once a killer, always a killer?
No, but I think once they will tell you, any of the killers we've looked at that had killed multiple times, they will say once you've crossed the line, that's very hard. But those are serial killers. These are not serial killers. These are solo, if you will. Yes, they have crossed the line once, and whether. But as I said, the statistics are in their favor in terms of repeating or recidivism.
Emmy Nikolov is asking this. Thank you so much for being here, Emmy. Dr. Burgess, what do you think will happen?
I'm feeling more optimistic that the judge went along with and overrode the district attorney. Now, whether that will happen today, we don't know. But if he is, we would hope he would do the same thing and move this along to the parole. And then the parole still has an opportunity. They're doing a risk assessment and the regular rituals they have to go through. And then it goes up to another panel. So I think there are many safeguards put into this whole process that people need to, I think, need to understand and need to watch. I just hope that it continues. I think it will. I think that the first time that the judge moved it along, I think that he, hopefully, and if he doesn't, there still are two other avenues that they can take.
Yeah, I had read that they can go to Governor Gavin Newsom if they want. Interesting to see how that would go. Yeah, I'm very curious. And I also find it so interesting that the judge last week denied the withdrawal, just
Yes.
fascinating. A lot of people are talking in the comment section,
Uh-huh.
and hopefully you can explain this as a clinical psychologist. Why is it in this type of family dynamic? Why is it that the mother wouldn't try to stop Jose?
Because she was committed to him. That's her priority. I think it's just very simple that she was not going to leave him. And I think she knew about some of the things that were going on with him in other situations. And she still, and don't forget, we're back in the 80s. And this is something that women did do, that they stuck with the husband. Excuse me.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating how different of a day it was. I just watched the Netflix docuseries yesterday for the second time, and it was so interesting to me to watch, all these night shows laughing and mocking these young boys on the stand that are literally belting out their hearts, like saying things that the public didn't understand then. The embarrassment. Can you explain that a little bit further and what that was like to see some of that testimony?
The testimony on their emotional reaction to all
Yeah.
of this and why they
Yeah.
did, in terms of the brothers or in terms of the
In
uh,
terms of just what that was like to, I wasn't alive in that day yet. What that was like to witness this all going on, and people mocking these young men.
right, and it was men on. Usually, it was the males, rather than the females. I remember at the time there was a lot of outcry, both for the brothers and then, of course, what, as you said, the mocking of it. And I think that shows you where the gender gap was at that time. The question is, I think, as you've asked, is where is it now? Do we have that? Do we have any that begin to understand trauma? It's a hard thing for people to understand that males uh, can be hurt, can be injured psychologically.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's a new day about just how men should be raised, how little boys should be raised, and so they can express their feelings and what are their feelings so they can acknowledge their feelings so it doesn't act out in different ways. It's just so interesting, this case. I just want to look through a couple other questions that people have.
Okay.
Justin in the universe saying this: when you're that powerful and rich, everyone is in your pockets. I have seen you on other podcasts really talk about the type of person that you had heard that Jose Menendez was like. Can you kind of share with us, obviously not just from Erik Menendez, what you had learned, but what were other things that you had learned about who Jose Menendez was like dealing with?
Yeah, we looked up, they spent a lot of time. I know that Leslie Abramson's team spent a lot of time trying to get into that very, very question to see if there was anything. And he did have an interesting background that I think he had big ideas too, that he wanted to be a senator, I think, from the country that he came from. And so was building, I says that's a better way of saying it, was building a career, if you will, that was going to really reach high levels, if you will. Maybe he would even want to be higher than that. But there was also a lot of, because he was in media, it was interesting to learn about some of the media that he was in charge of, and that there was certainly some dark side to that. And that was never, I don't think ever, I don't know how much ever came out about that, but the power certainly wasn't just all positive, but that he could use people. I think that's what they're getting into. And certainly the the boy band is another example that he felt he could do anything and anything that he wanted. So I was not surprised to see that there had been another. We had hoped, or the team had hoped, that they could find another example that would have made a big difference, if you will, in the trial. But evidently he was not able to come forward at that particular time.
Do you
But
think
I
it's
think Andy Cano, the cousin, I think that's a very powerful letter that came out and says quite a bit.
mm-hmm.
Because
And I know, no, please, sorry, continue.
no, and I know in some of the drawings that Erik did, he had referenced his cousin. He was very close to that cousin, Andy.
I remember in some of the podcasts that you have done, you have said that it was even the writing on your drawings, and correct me if I'm saying this wrong, it was the writing, his writing on the drawings that also prove that that letter was his handwriting.
Right. I thought it was I'm no expert, but I mean, it was certainly, people can just look and see how much it matches.
Do you think ultimately, do you think that they should be released?
I do. I have no question about it. I do. I think that what they've gone through, and certainly the things they've said, and their regrets, and how they felt the minute, like after the shot was fired, how they talked about wishing they could just take every bit of that back. And you've got to remember that when people do these kinds of things, they're in a very heat of the emotion of why they're doing it. And I think that because there were two of them, that made a difference. It wasn't like there's just one. And we do have a lot of examples where the fear, people act out of fear. Afterwards, they may say, well, I don't know why I was so fearful. But at the time, this is their emotion.
How is, say, and I always find this so interesting, but how is, say, somebody who's been, right, a serial killer, say, how is the psychological brain of somebody of a serial killer different than somebody who's a one-time killer?
Well, the serial killer is killing for different motives, and that's what much of our work was on, is much more of a sexual motive. And that isn't present in many of these solo types, that their motive is quite different. You can have multiple motives. So the serial killer is acting on a fantasy that he has rehearsed over and over and gets as much emotion out of it just thinking about it. You don't have that usually in a solo killer. You can have someone that on the spur of the moment, more impulsive, more disorganized, just feels that's their only way of getting out of a situation, which I think is what we have here versus the serial killer. They're very different. And that even we're looking at now in the mass shooting killer, that's even advancing, unfortunately. All these school shootings there's a whole nother motive going on.
Would you say that most people that have killed someone, do they have this regret that you kind of spoke about that you said that Erik Menendez had?
I do. If they have really thought about it, guilt can be a powerful punishment, if you will, kind of a factor. And you can have accidents, horrible accidents, where people haven't planned anything and a horrible accident happens, and they can still feel very guilty about it. Car accidents, things like that. Certainly, we know the combat stress and is a powerful reminder, and how many of our veterans have great trouble resolving things that they did in the service of their duty, duty in the military.
Cynthia in Spain is asking this. Dr. Burgess, did Kitty abuse the boys too? I heard she was in bed with, and then I can't see the rest of it. She was in bed and that's it.
Yeah, I don't have any information on that. But don't forget, the psychological abuse was heavy in that house. So that if she was supporting Jose, which she was, she would go along with whatever infraction there was. So from that standpoint, I think yes, but I never had any information that she herself did anything specifically directly to the brothers.
In your research, have you been able to, and I'm sure probably, when it comes to something like this, it's so interesting because I think of Kitty being in a marriage like this. You have him with allegedly his sons, right? Finding pleasure from his sons. I mean, what goes on through a person's mind who is married to a person like this? I can't imagine the jealousy, yet the fear, yet the control. What happens in a person's mind like this?
Well, we can only I don't want to generalize from this case, but we can say in this case that she had her own thoughts about what was going on with Jose and whether she was more worried about his having affairs and things like that. She was not thinking of his abusing the brothers, I don't think. But what goes on in her mind, of course, we are not going to know. We can only know that she had, from the description that the brothers gave, she had her own problems in terms of drugs and alcohol and things like that, which in those days was not unusual. We're talking about the 80s, 70s and 80s. And you had Jose, who was a very powerful, everybody wanted something from him. So she had that. I think that's what she was more concerned about.
Wow. It's just such a fascinating case. And it's fascinating how different the world is today and what we think about sexual abuse. I'm going to leave it with this, you guys. If you have any other questions, let me know. But thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ann Burgess. This is like, when you wrote me back, I was like, oh my God, you've had this incredible career. Like, you've been a trailblazer, you've a clinical psychologist, so well educated, a professor, an author, former psychiatric nurse. I mean, just the career goes on, and it's just remarkable what you have done in your lifetime. And I can't thank you enough for coming on today. And I know everyone else feels the same. Everybody in the comments is like, she's a legend. So thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And you guys, Joel is going to come on here soon, and he's going to be talking, of course, about the resentencing hearing happening all day today and all day tomorrow. Should be very interesting to watch and see what happens. But that's it for me today, and I will see you guys next week, 12 noon Central Time or 1 Eastern. Bye, guys. Thanks for being here today. Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Dr. Burgess.
Bye-bye.